Hello, Tor Lacey here with a reading of part of the chapter Stratigraphy, Reading the Pages of Earth History from your lecture textbook, Historical Geology, a free online textbook for historical geology courses. This reading will begin with the section titled Basic Principles of Stratigraphy. The history of a basin is recorded in its strata. Throughout the Earth's 4.5 billion year history, the interactions between the geosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, exosphere, and biosphere have evolved. These systems have evolved together throughout Earth's past and, over time, the result of this interplay has also changed. The introduction of the biosphere during the Archean eon, for example, had a significant effect on how these systems have interacted with one another. The interplay between these spheres and the progressive nature of their development together has left a long rock record. While the record is incomplete, much of this long history is recorded in basins as sedimentary rocks. Sediments deposited in basins and containing the evidence of this past accumulate under the force of gravity in layers. It is these layers that make up the strata of the stratigraphic record. These records vary across time, geography, and tectonic situation, but there are some basic principles, a kind of rock grammar, that guide our interpretation of their story. These tools of stratigraphy are the geoscience equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, allowing us to peer into past worlds and translate what we find. Strata and stratigraphy, the pages of Earth's history. Sedimentary layers are called strata. Strata form the stratigraphic record of the basin. The word stratigraphy comes from the Latin roots that can literally translated as layer writing. Weathered sediments are eroded into basins and deposited in laterally extensive horizontal layers. These strata form bedding and beds. Beds of strata accumulate into formations, the functional unit of stratigraphy. Formations, as collections of strata deposited in related environments, represent a collective facies. A facies is a body of rock with specific characteristics, such as the quartz sands and cross-bedded structures that might make up a sandstone that was once a beach. The principle of original horizontality describes this tendency for strata to form in a flat orientation. All sediments that eventually lithify into rock formations were originally laid down in a horizontal fashion. As these horizontal strata accumulate in the basin, younger strata will lie on top of older strata. This is called the Principle of Superposition. Both of these principles were first formulated by Nicholas Steno in 17th century Italy, and were the result of years of observations he made of rock strata in the Italian Alps. Horizontal and successively younger strata will retain much information about not only the environments in which they were deposited, but also the original rocks from which they weathered before that. Each layer of strata contains a detailed story. The gigapan image below illustrates these layers or strata very nicely. This formation is no longer horizontal, but was originally. It was tilted by tectonic activity. Prior to that activity, these layers of alternating sandstones, siltstones, and shales were deposited deep underwater as multiple series of submarine landslides. These are called Boyuma sequences and begin with the massive light tan sandstones, which become gradually finer in grain size upward through the package. Each package is a new deposit, a new landslide at the time. The oldest rocks in the image are in the lower right and the youngest in the lower left. So oldest here, youngest up here. And this would be the before mentioned package with the coarsest material at the bottom and then getting finer upwards, and then that cycle repeating. So coarser, finer, coarser, finer, coarser, finer, etc. Each one of those representing a single landslide event. Another very critical aspect of stratigraphy is understanding that depositional environments preserved in vertically stacked strata occurring in geologic contact with one another were also at one point laterally adjacent depositional environments. This is called Walther's principle. Basins are not static, and sea levels change for a variety of reasons. As they do this, environments that exist in time next to one another will migrate laterally. Over time, they will stack on top of one another. Eventually, this creates a sequence we see as rocks at outcrops, similar to the layers of cake in the image below. Formations and Walther's principle. As mentioned above, when sediments are deposited into a basin, they are affected and also affect the basin. Where sediments ultimately come to rest is dependent upon the energy level of the system and how it is able to handle sediment grain size. Generally, the energy level of water-moving sediments decreases as gradient shallows from mountains to the sea, gradually leaving behind successively smaller particles. Beaches, locations many of us are very familiar with, are full of sand because the energy levels at the seashore are well suited to that grain size. In deeper water, grain sizes diminish even more until all you find are marine muds well offshore. These successive sedimentological changes, along with the flora and fauna adapted to living in them, and the unique structures created, are how we determine local facies. The facies are the characteristics of a rock formed under its unique depositional environment. Along a seashore, sedimentary facies will display a gradual decrease in grain size from areas well above the tidal zone, supertidal, to areas well below the wave base, deep marine. In these seashore locations, one of the key variables that affects how strata develop through facies are changes in sea level. Sea level change is continuous. Sediment deposition along shorelines is also continuous during these changes in sea level. When sea level rises, we call it a transgression. When it falls, we call it a regression. As water level rises or transgresses, something interesting happens. These faces migrate shoreward also. Likewise, as water levels drop or regresses, facies migrate seaward. Named after the German geologist Johannes Walther as Walther's principle, these ideas describe how changes in sea level lead to changes in stratigraphic stacking of strata or sequences. Please watch this video below for an excellent explanation. Before doing that, let's scroll back up here, and I'll reread this last sentence. Along a seashore, sedimentary facies will display a gradual decrease in grain size from areas well above the tidal zone, supertidal, to areas well below the wave base, deep marine. So, in this illustration, as we go from land to deeper sea, left to right across the image, we have coarser, medium, and finer, and then the finest material found in the deepest water or lowest energy environment. Okay, I'm assuming that you have taken the time to watch this very important video. Speaking for myself, I found it very informative, and it helped me understand this Walther's principle much better. So pause now if you haven't watched it, and then come back to the reading. As seen in the video above, Walther's principle applies to both siliclastic basins and carbonate basins. In siliclastic basins, our shoreward to deep marine progression might begin with conglomerate and then continue offshore with sandstone, siltstone, and end with mudstone. As sea level rises, deep marine facies will be pushed shoreward and deposited on top of shallower water units in a fining upward sequence, typically of a transgressive sequence. Likewise, if sea level regresses, shoreward facies will migrate toward the sea, being deposited on top of deeper water facies, creating a stratigraphic succession of coarsening upward layers. In carbonate systems, the shoreward to deep marine sequence runs from grainstone, mostly fossil material, so think of lots of shell fragments, to packstone, waxstone, more mud, and ends with limey mudstone. The same transgressive and regressive sequencing applies with changes in sea level up and down these environments. To go back here, these terms you may not be familiar with. So with grainstone, again, think of a limestone that's mostly fossils. On the other end, in the deepest water, lowest energy environments, limey mudstone would have no fossils and would just be a very fine crystallized limestone, that being crystallized calcite making up the limestone. Packages of stratigraphic sequences can be transgressive or regressive in nature. When a transgressive sequence lies below a regressive sequence, the boundary between them is referred to as a maximum flooding surface. Likewise, the top of a regressive sequence is erosional and referred to as a sequence boundary. Pattern matching and stratigraphic correlation. Millions of years of weathering and erosion shape our landscapes. Over that time, the records of deposition in ancient basins are washed away, often leaving only sparse remnants of these strata. Measured stratigraphic sections, separated by great distances due to erosion, provide the record necessary to reconstruct these larger ancient environments. The process of connecting layers across these distances is called correlation. Such correlation typically focuses on thicker strata, but it also can be done in some cases with microstratigraphic strata, such as minute beds of fossils, volcanic ash beds, impact deposits, etc. Stratigraphic correlation is about making connections. It is a set of scientific activities that seek to match rock patterns across distances. There are a wide variety of ways that stratigraphic patterns are identified and matched, and quite commonly, the patterns do not match up perfectly. Bedding thicknesses vary over distances, beds pinch out between outcrops. Sometimes, in some places, a new bed is introduced. Physical or chemical characteristics may be missing. The reasons for these variations are multiple. Simple way to consider these variations is to imagine walking along the coast of eastern North America and observing the changes you see. While there are many commonalities between the beaches of Florida, Virginia, and New Jersey, changes in the shape of the shoreline, development of large bays, variations in water chemistry, the presence or absence of barrier islands, subtle climate variations, inflowing river channels, the slope of the continental shelf, and a great many other features along the coast will cause shoreline conditions to change. As a result, these natural physical variations, populations of organisms, and even entire ecosystems will vary too. Post-lithification processes can also erase physical and chemical characteristics of the rocks through compaction and diagenesis. All of this natural variation can make correlation quite tricky. Stratigraphers, the geoscientists who study the patterns within sedimentary rock layers, have developed a variety of complementary methods that aid in correlation between sites. Ultimately, these tools help establish relative age connections between distant units, sometimes separated by millions of years of erosion, tectonic uplift, and change, and other geological processes. Dual gigapans of Tonolo Way Formation along Corridor H. You are seeing two sides of the highway at the same location. Click on the title of the gigapan and then make it full screen so you can play with the image. How would you go about correlating these layers from one side to the other? For what distinctive features might you look? List some in the quiz below. I'm continuing now, assuming that you have examined the GigaPan images and taken the quiz. If not, please pause and go back and do that. Patterns that emerge from measured stratigraphic sections represent not only environmental changes on various scales, but also record the local interactions with the biosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and even the exosphere, the space environment. If stratigraphy is a record of events in a basin over time, then it will be recorded in complex ways due to the interactions between systems. There will be a record of climate change and large-scale weather events, biosphere events, evolutionary change, changes in Earth's magnetic field, and astronomical events that leave an impact, pun intended. Such changes will often be global and regional in nature and occur across different environments, requiring an analysis focused on events in time across a region. Over years, stratigraphers have developed various subfields to help provide focused study in these areas. These subfields of stratigraphy include chronostratigraphy, lithostratigraphy, biostratigraphy, and magnetico-stratigraphy. Together, these fields provide tools allowing the piecing together of the geological past. Lithostratigraphy. The name lithostratigraphy comes from the Greek word lithos, meaning rock, and strata, meaning layers. So lithostratigraphy is the study of rock layers. In lithostratigraphy, we are very interested in the sediment grains that make up these layers. We want to know about their mineral composition. We want to examine their shape, whether they are rounded or not. We also want to know something about their sorting, whether they contain a diverse mix of grain sizes or just one grain size. These pieces of evidence describe, in part, the facies of the rock, which allow scientists to determine how the rock was formed and where it might have originated. In stratigraphic section, stacked strata will often vary from bottom to top, indicating a detailed record of environmental change. This record provides a history of the sediment deposition in that basin, changes in sea level, and can also provide some important insights to climate fluctuations, all at a variety of time scales. In lithostratigraphy, rock strata are placed in a hierarchy based on several key factors. Key among these is their lateral regional extent. The basic lithostratigraphic unit is called the formation. In order to be given this designation, a layer of rock must be mappable across an area. It must bear the very similar characteristics when seen in locations across that area and have similar distinct boundaries or contacts with layers above and below. Formations are the units used by field geologists when creating geologic maps. Formations also have a type section identified that represents the outcrop from which the standard description of that unit was created. They also have contacts with formations above and below, which are also mappable. Within formations, smaller subunits called members can be identified. A member is a lithological distinct bed within the larger formation. In stratigraphic columns below, the Kobe Formation is divided into several members, and within these members, beds are discernible. The type Cincinnatian is an ideal section for the study of individual beds, as they are often laterally extensive and therefore traceable across the region. A single limestone bed, such as those numbered 25 through 31 in column C below, mark distinct moments in time across the region. If enough stratigraphic sections exist from across a region, further patterns will emerge. Road cuts, cliff faces, and other locations are ideal study areas. Individual rock layers may or may not be present in all of these. They may vary in thickness and content, but this information can help reconstruct the history of not just a single location as represented by one section, but an entire region. Take a moment here to study this illustration and connect it to what has been summarized in the text above. After you've studied the illustration titled Upper Ordovician Stratigraphy of the Cincinnati, Ohio region, we'll move on down here. This gigapan is showing normal fault in chalk, correlation of both sides of the fault. Try to match up the two sides by moving the gigapan image around. Can you get rid of one of the faults? If so, you've just correlated the layers. Again, assuming that you have studied the gigapan, I'll move on here. Lithostratigraphic hierarchy. Flow, if volcanic materials are included. Bed member formation. Basic lithostratigraphic unit, group, and supergroup. Packages of formations can be put together into groups. Packages of groups can be assembled into supergroups. Such higher designations are not always necessary or ideal, but in situations where the rock formations are closely related, their use makes good sense. The Grand Canyon supergroup and the Belt supergroup are two well-known American examples of this largest designation. Fossils as stratigraphic tools, biostratigraphy. Biostratigraphy is a set of tools used to correlate patterns and beds using fossils. Fossils come in a variety of forms, either as body fossils, such as skeletal parts, or impressions, or trace fossils, evidence of movements or activity. Usually, this information is collected in addition to the lithostratigraphic information. Biostratigraphic designations are based upon the existence of a particular diagnostic feature within strata specific to fossil material. Sometimes, such fossil material can be traced over great distances, much like lithostratigraphic layers. Biostratigraphic units can vary across a location, and so such tracing of fossil beds is not necessarily a basic goal of biostratigraphy. Communities within an ecosystem vary across an environment, depending upon physical and biological conditions. Water depth, temperature, salinity, and currents, along with sedimentation rates and nutrient levels, can cause the distribution of particular organisms to be quite spotty. However, some fossils are more ubiquitous. For instance, due to planktonic life habits, and so are found more commonly over larger areas as they are spread by currents. Because of all this variation, while biostratigraphic designations can be used to correlate beds, they are also very important tools for understanding the paleoecological history of a location. Scroll back up to this. This illustration is titled A Simple Example of Biostratigraphic Correlation. So on the left, this stratigraphic column is being matched to the stratigraphic column or section on the right, based on the fossils contained in the strata. Index fossils. Across basins or even within a basin, fossil assemblages can vary a great deal. Consider a modern oceanic shoreline, even one with a barrier island system like the Outer Banks of North Carolina. In such areas, there are species that live across facies and species whose lives are spent entirely within more restricted zones. Species with a broader distribution that are plentiful and that fossilize well can serve very well as markers for important intervals. Ideally, the organism's existence is short-lived. If all these criteria are met, then that fossil can serve as a marker in strata, an index fossil. Some excellent examples of index fossils can be found here. In this illustration here, titled Some Common Index Fossils, notice that these are matched to their geologic period according to the geologic time scale. So we go from the Cambrian period, going back about 540 million years ago, up to modern day. So as you probably know you can find seashells that look like this today, but these did not exist in previous geologic periods. That's the end of the required reading for this chapter. Thank you for listening.